I am going to add my disclaimer that I am not a medical professional or a doctor right up front. So I will talk about the stuff I do know about, and I will say when I do not know about things. And I'm lucky enough to have a lot of doctors in my panel when it comes to both protocol and Maya. So I'm very happy to take away any questions we have and come back with responses if I don't know the answer. We're going to talk today about hormones, and most people would automatically assume that I'm talking about specifically sex hormones. We're going to talk about a lot of hormones. Sex hormones will be in there. So if we've got specific questions about that, we can always go into more depth. But this is a really important topic because we started with energy levels and energy management in the first session. We talked about sleep and the foundations in the second session. And the amount we're sleeping and how we're managing our energy and our cortisol levels has a significant impact on all of our hormone levels as well. So now we're going to tie it all together in terms of our endocrine system and how we can very often, from an executive perspective, end up with near medical grade burnout, but often somewhere in between just disrupted hormones and burnout on a very, very long period. So it can be up to a decade before we get treatment. And the reason this is super important is often when we go and have baseline tests on our hormones, we're told our results are within the range of normal. But the challenge with that is all of the data from that is not based on a normal population or a population that's optimizing themselves. So effectively, when the doctor says, oh, your thyroid, for example, or your TSH is within the normal range, their test base is not from a healthy population, it's from unhealthy populations. And it just means you're in the top 5 percentile of that. Whereas obviously what we are optimizing for is not just not diseased, we're optimizing for optimal and peak performance as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about the biomarkers. I am going to go into some depth about the different elements of the hormone system and how they interact. The reason this is quite key, and I see this time and time and time again with clients, they will go and have their test. It might be their annual medical test, or they may have even gone to the doctor to say, oh, I feel really run down. I can't seem to really psych up the energy I used to be able to. I'm sleeping for 7 to 8 hours a night, but I'm waking up and I'm still exhausted, or I'm still foggy and I can't get going. And they will do these tests typically around things like TSH when it comes to the thyroid. And I'm going to come into the detail on the thyroid shortly. But they will do these tests and they'll come back and they'll say, as I said, your results are fairly normal, nothing to be worried about. We'll monitor it, come back in 6 months, come back in a year. But really what we want is to be testing multiple different elements around the thyroid gland. So we want TSH, we also want T4, we want T3 to determine whether there is underperformance or overperformance. And the issue with that is once we can intervene, when we look at things like the thyroid, when we look at things like the amount of iron, so ferritin in the system, and also vitamin D, we can have lifestyle interventions and also medical interventions that will significantly, within a period of sort of 8 to 12 weeks, impact people's energy levels, their ability to focus, their brain fog, everything else. So this is really how it's impacting how we show up every day in every situation. The tested population on which doctors are basing their normal is typically potentially diseased, and they are looking at pathology. They're not looking at optimization. So if you aren't actually showing any symptoms of disease, the doctor is not incentivized or even trained to treat you. Whereas what we are looking at when it comes to the coaching element and also the Build Better Bodies element is really how do you have optimal performance? So how do we make sure that your thyroid is operating at an optimal level? How do we test that you don't have any autoimmune diseases? And how do we make sure things like your vitamin D and your iron are at optimal levels as well? The other challenge around normal results is gender differences aren't typically taken into account, and there are very different levels for men and women, and also age differences aren't taken into account. So you might have a population that's ranging all the way from 20 to 82, and we would expect, because of the changes we go through as we're aging, to see different levels of hormones over those time periods as well. So we're looking at a very different goal. What we want really is all of you to be fully fired up, feeling really energetic, feeling very energized and engaged when you wake up. And what I see a lot in my coaching practice is senior executives who have gradually declined in terms of energy levels, and they think that something is wrong with them, but they're being told something isn't because they don't have a disease. But what they do have is effectively a number of hormonal challenges that can be treated very easily with lifestyle interventions, and then also potentially medication if we ask for the correct tests and the correct treatment from the medical profession. I know there's a lot of detail, but I just wanted to talk about the different elements in our hormone control centers throughout the entire body. The first one to think about, and I've put this into kind of office terms, you have your hypothalamus. So that's the CEO that sort of takes all of the information in, and it does a lot of sensing. So things like stress levels, the environment you're in, hunger levels, how much pressure you're under. That will send messages to your pituitary gland. So I call that the COO because the pituitary decides what to issue out in terms of orders to other parts of the body that manage your hormone levels. So it will take that information that's being sent through the hypothalamus, and then it will execute those orders in terms of going to a few areas. So your adrenal glands, and obviously adrenaline, adrenal, so you'll realize these are related to stress hormones. They're about the size of a walnut, and they're on the top of your kidneys. Depending on the signals they're getting from your pituitary gland, they will release adrenaline and cortisol and DHEA, which generates our sex hormones. We also have our thyroid, which is here in our throat. So our pituitary gland is just here behind our nose, but at the base of our spine, and that will signal to your thyroid. And that really controls your metabolism. So it's going to control your energy levels. And we have something called TSH, which is your thyroid stimulating hormone. And then we have two T's, which are effectively the iodine components. So you have triiodine, which is T3. That's the one that your body can actually utilize, but your body has to convert it in your liver from T4. So we have a lot more T4 in our body, and the amount of T3 and T4 that we have is decided by how much TSH is in our system. So the pituitary signals TSH, and then that determines how much T3 and T4 we have in our body. And then finally, our very much underappreciated liver is the most amazing organ in the world. Like, it's basically your manufacturing capability, but it's also a big part of your cleaning capability as well when it comes to things like hormones. And within that, it converts T4 into T3, which is the one that we can use, as I said, which the body can actually mobilize. It breaks down all of our used hormones when it's not under too much pressure, and it makes transport proteins. And there are a couple of other areas, so things like our pancreas, which secretes insulin, and we'll talk a little bit about insulin sensitivity. But all of these are in a loop together. And what happens when they're working very healthily is your hypothalamus is doing the sensing. It will tell the pituitary what to then execute in terms of stress hormones. That will go to your adrenals, to your adrenal glands, and that will produce the right amount of adrenaline and cortisol depending on the scenario. And we talked last week about having that big jump up in terms of stress when there's a stimulus, and then recovery, and having that come down once that stimulus is gone. And the challenge that we see at the moment is people are just having that baseline continually increase. And what happens when we're under chronic stress is that signal keeps getting fired again and again and again. In the first couple of years, so I've got 1 to 5 here, you're seeing a lot of high cortisol, which means you've got the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenals axis continually stimulated as opposed to having any rest. The thyroid works a lot harder. So your TSH levels will be high and your sex hormones are declining because your DHEA levels are dropping as a result. So people will typically experience a drop in libido. They will find it harder to get stimulated because they're constantly slightly overwhelmed, but they will be able to push through for the first 5 years. After 5 to 10 years of this happening, presuming there's no sort of significant change in the environment and they continue to be stimulated, then they start to have that cortisol fatigue, which I talked about last week, which is effectively they're overwhelmed. It doesn't then trigger the same response in the body. And the thyroid can't keep up. So it will keep trying to produce the TSH, the stimulating hormone. And very often we then develop something called Hashimoto's. Women are a few times, like 5 to 8 times more likely to have Hashimoto's, but it's fundamentally a thyroid disorder and an autoimmune disease. And it often presents in things like cold hands, inability to sleep, huge intolerance to gluten, migraines, and a lot of sex hormones declining even further. Now symptoms become obvious. So we're seeing some physical symptoms. We're really, really overwhelmed. We can't actually get motivated by anything at this point in time. And this is very often when people are starting to get concerned about, well, am I burning out? And then once we get past the 10 years of this continuous stress and this continuous stress response, we end up with adrenal exhaustion. So those adrenal glands simply cannot really fire anymore. The cortisol is not triggering anything there. We have clinical hypothyroidism, which means basically our thyroid just starts underperforming hugely because it's receiving so much stimulating hormone. It's got enough T3, enough T4, but it's just not being mobilized because the liver can't break it down, can't convert it. Very, very low sex hormones, multiple autoimmune diseases. So this might come out in things like skin conditions, digestive issues, and then we've got performance, and this is medical burnout, effectively, where people just collapse and cannot continue anymore. This is very frustrating because it is entirely preventable. And if in those first 1 to 5 years, people are getting proper testing, proper biomarkers, it's actually possible for us to intervene at that point, make lifestyle interventions, and then also actually have some of these challenges treated. I will pause there because I've covered a lot. And obviously, I will send the slides around as I always do. There's a lot more detail on the slides. But if I go through the whole thing, we'll be here for the full hour. Any questions so far?
Could I ask just one question? And that is that I suppose, known to be a relatively laid back individual, actually. Not that I'm horizontal right now, but I would be known. And I think that probably comes partly with the territory of being a creative as well. And so that probably helps. But it's very hard for me to tell what the relative, how to gauge whether I am overly stressed or not, or what the relative sort of relationships of these things are. And certainly I've had conversations in the past about that. So it takes a lot for me to really feel stressed. Now,
Hmm.
what I'm wondering is what the relationship is with feeling stressed and being stressed, because it's a very hard thing to kind of gauge if you don't, if you're, because I can't tell the chemical changes. And very fortunately, I don't, I think, exhibit some of the things you're talking about there, which I'm really fortunate about. But at the same time, whether or not I'm on the path, it's really hard to tell. Maybe the
And
fact I can even ask the question means I'm not. I don't know.
I mean, hopefully it means you're not. You will tend to notice. So, from a chemical change perspective, this will present in certain ways. So, as I said, things like dysregulation of our metabolism, so the inability to energize ourselves at all. Also, effectively, what happens is our cortisol patterns get inverted if we're extremely stressed. So, in theory, our cortisol should be fairly high in the morning. That's what wakes us up and gets us going. And over the course of the day, that comes down so that by the evening, it's quite low and we're ready and we can go to bed and we can sleep. What happens when we're continuously stimulated and the chemical changes happen in our body is we very often ended up what we call tired but wired. So we'll wake up in the morning, we desperately need coffee to get ourselves even started. And then, so we feel very exhausted in the morning, but then by the evening, we find it really hard to switch off. And that's very, very common in today's day and age, particularly since the pandemic and lockdowns, because we're all staring at screens and logging back in and we're still wired because we're still checking emails at 11 p.m. and everything else. So I think, and obviously, and I don't think you were here when I did my early medical disclaimer, obviously not a doctor, but if you're not experiencing physical symptoms, for example, being very wired by the evening, and I know you quite like to work because you do creative stuff, so it's hard to tell, right? It might be just that you're passionate about what you're doing and you're in a flow state. But then other elements, if it's getting to a really chronic stage, and ideally it's getting nowhere near that by the time it gets caught, but if it's getting to a really chronic stage, you will find things like psoriasis, eczema, IBS, inability to digest foods, visceral reactions against certain foods. So your body will effectively tell you something is very wrong. And with an autoimmune disease, that's effectively our body turning on itself because you're so overwhelmed, you're so stressed, your stress response is turning on itself, and then you start to actually attack your own cells and tissues.
No, that's really interesting, Liz. Thanks. So, what's interesting is you can see me scratching my head. I do have psoriasis actually, but only in my hair.
Mm.
And I have some shampoo and blah blah blah. And I once went to see someone, and they said to me, uh, I think I probably had it from very young. Actually, said to me, "Well, you can't. It's not treatable, and so it's not curable." So I have some shampoo and blah blah blah, and that certainly makes it easier, but it doesn't go away. And if there is
Mm.
a relationship in here, actually, which they may well be, actually, if there is a relationship in there, because I've noticed it certainly has got far worse in the past few years when I've been particularly going through some of the stressful things I have been more
Yeah.
recently.
Psoriasis is very closely related with stress, and I'll send over some information on that because it's a topic that's come up with a lot of my clients. So I've
As a
actually gone and gleaned quite a few sort of workbooks and stuff on this one. So I'm very
Yeah,
happy to
thanks,
share
Liz.
that.
And I appreciate you're not an MD and so on, so don't worry. It's
I
no,
just
no,
have to be
no.
super clear.
Of course, I won't hold you to account on any of that. So
I'm a very interested party. I am not a doctor. But yes, so yes, Sinead.
I think I come onto these calls, Liz, in the expectation that I'm going to have a moment of panic at some stage going, oh my God, what is happening to me? And this is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I guess there are two things, and maybe you'll come to it. But we spend so much time in the corporate world investing in our own resilience and in our team's resilience. And I wonder whether that may be counterintuitive to what I'm seeing here. Have I been protecting myself in one way from a resilience perspective and ignoring some of the other potential quieter symptoms? Because obviously from the age range here, I'm veering towards, you know, the bottom end of your list here. And I'm concerned that, you know, I've been focusing on the wrong stuff over the last 10, 15 years or so.
So help me understand what you mean by focused on the wrong stuff. Would you say that
If
any of this is presenting for you without getting too personal?
No, I mean, I think, you know, in terms of general stress and burnout and exhaustion, per the conversations last week, I think, you know, your hormones are going to be responsible for components of that. So I may not be presenting specifically the things in this list, but I'm sure a lot of the feelings that I do have are related to my hormones. So if I've been kind of focusing on the, dare I say, softer skills around resilience and not actually being tested for levels of hormones, etc., you know, is that an error?
I don't think it's an error, but I do think we are coming to a time now where we are realizing how closely interconnected the softer skills. So if I think about things like empathy, compassion, our ability to show up and do that is very closely connected to how we're feeling, what's actually happening physiologically in our bodies. Because certainly when I was growing up in the corporate world, like our head, we were expected that was expected to be completely separate from that, right? But even down to what we eat, what we drink, how we sleep is going to affect our mood and how we show up and whether we can even tap into stuff like emotional intelligence. So I don't think there's a right or a wrong, but I think we're learning a lot more about how much harder we have made it for ourselves by not focusing on things like this. And particularly from, and you mentioned age, so forgive me for saying this, but as we're going through perimenopause and our estrogen levels are dropping, for women, it's not like our cortisol is spiking up and down in the normal pattern that a man would see at the same age. Our cortisol is slowly building and it keeps building. And unfortunately, what that means is we have things like waking up in the middle of the night, mind racing. We have increased anxiety. And we think that there's something wrong with us, but actually that's just that our cortisol level's so high and it's not being countered by estrogen. So that's why things like hormone therapy, which has had a really bad press for a long time, can be very important, because actually just through that phase in our life, it can help us bring those cortisol levels down, bring those estrogen levels up. We're just at a disadvantage if that's happening on the front of all of these other things as well, because they all feed into each other with this whole system.
Fascinating.
It's probably made it slightly harder for you, but you've been investing in those tools. I think the other thing to bear in mind is a lot of people are not investing in those resilience tools.
Yeah.
So they aren't even aware of that. So they would be even worse off, if you know what I mean, in that sense. They haven't been as proactive. Any other question?
Do you mind if I ask one more, Liz, if no one else has? And that is that because I have been in a host of conversations over time about perimenopause and menopause in women and so on. You did mention in one of your messages you sent through about, what's it called? Andropause? I know nothing about it. I barely even know the word. I sort of get you might have something you want to send through about that. But where is that in all of this? Because I'm sure there will be different, clearly, but probably not completely disassociated relationships.
Very similar relationships, actually. So andropause is caused by a drop in testosterone in men, which happens naturally over the course of the aging process, but it happens much faster when you have a few factors. So one is high levels of stress. The other can be the environment in terms of things like pollution. So I love Hong Kong dearly, but I am sat in one of the most polluted cities in the world. And it means that it does directly impact your hormone levels, including your testosterone. And so andropause, when men's testosterone drops, it can have a significant impact on things like confidence, obviously physical strength. And the number one indicator is a man waking up in the morning without an erection. So that is a signal of andropause, and it's something that many men just accept as a part of aging, as opposed to a physical indicator of actually my hormones might need some assistance here. So it's something that if that is happening, regardless of age, then it's something to go and speak to the doctor about, because there's something that they can supplement your testosterone. But when your testosterone drops, it has impacts on all of your other hormones. And the DHEA that I mentioned, which is generated as a part of this hormonal cycle, when that gets sort of negatively impacted by high stress levels, that means you're not generating as much testosterone. So women will stop generating as much testosterone and estrogen, and men will not generate as much testosterone. So their sex hormones are falling and failing them. And we're supposed to have those hormones, right? So yes, they decline over the years, but we are supposed to have them circulating in our bodies.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Liz. Obviously it's something I need to look up a bit. The question is how much is acceptable and how much is
Hmm.
not, and when
Yeah.
do you, and what does assistance mean, and what does it look like, and how might you enter that and might not. And I guess it's the same for women, from what Sinead was saying as well. It's the same. It's just, but how do you even have that conversation? I mean, this is the first place I've ever had it, actually, to be honest. So thank you for that, for its first time.
No, and I think it's one of those things where sort of perimenopause and menopause is now a big discussion, even in workplaces. But I remember when that first started happening and an enormous amount of discomfort around that. But I think that men have not had the same exposure when it comes to this. So it's a more awkward conversation, but it is absolutely one for the doctor. And I can send some stuff through, and I will also send through, as a part of this, kind of recommendations on what people could ask their doctors specifically to test for things like thyroid, testosterone levels, everything else. Because when you go in armed with, actually, this is what I want tested, as opposed to just, I'm losing energy, I've been told it might be my thyroid, then they can be much, much more specific in terms of what they're testing and what you're looking for as well. So I will make sure to do that in part of the follow-up. Fantastic. All right. I will crack on if that's okay. So why, from a burnout perspective, why the standard labs miss it? And I know I've said this a little bit already about the sort of the healthy population versus the unhealthy population and what they're actually testing in their sample sizes. But when we look at TSH, so that's the thyroid stimulating. So when I talk about the thyroid, it's doing a lot. So it's controlling our energy and our metabolism. It's actually having a really big impact on our brain function. So often when we get brain fog and we have issues with memory or concentration, it's because we've got some challenges with our thyroid, and also our processing speed and our mood. It impacts our physical performance, so it'll impact heart rate. Very often, if someone has issues with thyroid, they will start getting a racing heart and think they're having panic attack, but it can be very often to do with the amount of TSH in their bodies. Muscle function, recovery, and tolerance for exercise. And we've obviously talked about the importance of exercise in previous sessions in terms of regulation, energizing, metabolic health. And obviously, if you just don't have the energy to even go and pick up the weights or go out for that walk in the sunshine, then it's going to really negatively impact that. And then finally, it's very much front and center when it comes to body composition. So often in midlife, we find that we start to put weight on around our middle. That's very often to do with the thyroid and the relationship between thyroid, cortisol, and then our insulin sensitivity, with insulin being produced by the pancreas. So it's really our thyroid hormones are kind of our metabolic throttling function, saying whether to speed up, slow down, and how much energy we need at any one moment in time. So obviously when your thyroid starts slowing down, then that's when we start to see people sort of really have challenges with weight, energy levels, brain fog, concentration. So they just feel like they don't know themselves anymore. But when we go to the doctor and we say we don't really feel like ourselves, that's not something that they can go on that well. So they'll check and they'll see if you're in what they call the normal range, but we're not looking for normal, we're looking for optimal. Then we have iron, and I've got ferritin here, but there are actually a few different iron tests that you can get done. Ferritin doesn't tell the whole story, but it does tell it gives the most clear indicator whether something is really, really off to start with. And iron actually can be very low for both men and women. The doctor typically looks for it to be low in women because we menstruate, but it actually can be very low for men, and it can be very, very low, Sinead, you should know this, for marathon runners, because actually we break down the iron cells, the hemoglobin, as we're running. So that can be something that, as I've said here, in the disease range, they say you're not diseased if it's over 50 for energy per mil, but actually what we're looking for is around 50 for someone to have a lot of energy. So there's a big gap between what they're looking for, or what they will say, actually, no, it's okay, you can come back in 6 months or a year, versus what is optimal here. Vitamin D, a very popular supplement, and for good reason. And fun fact, it's not actually a vitamin, but it's called a vitamin because it was discovered at the time that vitamins were being classified. Vitamin D is in fact a hormone that is generated when the sunlight hits our skin and our body creates the hormone. So we're told that over 20 here is adequate, but actually for things like our immune function, for our mood regulation and our cognitive performance, it should be much, much higher. And so that's why very often people are supplementing with vitamin D, and they often put that with K2 as well, because that helps with calcium absorption in the body. So it's really, really good, particularly if you live in the Northern Hemisphere and you go through winters. Very, very good to have a supplement on vitamin D because we don't have as much natural sunlight. And actually, if you are of black skin or dark skin, then you need more. Because actually it takes a lot more sunlight to generate the same amount of vitamin D in your body, or then a lot more supplementation as well. And then finally, cortisol patterns. I know we've talked about this a lot, But normally what they will do is test once, and that's really not adequate because what we need to test is what the cycle is throughout the day. So as I said, we should be starting with high cortisol in the morning and then that coming down gradually over the day and then being low at night. So typically what we would recommend is getting a test where you test it 4 times through the day. And it's done just through a swab in your mouth. So you're just doing a cortisol test. It's testing the amount of cortisol in your saliva. That gets sent off, and then you can have your patterns tested there. But typically they will just test it once in the day. And depending on whether you've just been for a run, whether you've had any supplementation that morning and how stressed you are, then it's going to vary wildly. So we recommend looking for the pattern rather than a specific number on that front. And the reason I've focused on these, not the sex hormones, is these are typically the ones that are going to signify burnout and energy levels. So your metabolic rates, your calmness, your anxiety, your ability to show up and regulate your own mood will be determined by these hormones specifically. So the ones that predict burnout, you've got the thyroid cascade. So when that's not working properly, then your metabolism starts to slow down. Your energy production drops, and that's a bit of a vicious cycle, and because then you've got all of the signals saying we don't have any more reserves. You have brain fog, as I said, cold intolerance. So if you get very cold hands or feet, or just really struggle if you're in a cold environment, you will have weight gain, particularly around the midriff, energy crashes as well. And we sort of push through. So we use coffee, we use chocolate, we use whatever we need, but it just keeps cycling. So it reduces our ability and our resilience to deal with that. Iron deficiency without it being fully anemic, so above that 20, it means reduced oxygen to our brain. So it does mean that from a cognitive perspective, we're not functioning as optimally. So even if we've got sleep, we've got poor concentration, everything feels slightly harder. I know at least 2 people on this call who are taking iron supplements. They are not pleasant and they can be quite hard to take. They tend to be very large tablets, but it's very much worth speaking to your doctor about different types of iron testing and then the supplementation that can be provided after that. From a dysregulation perspective on cortisol, so by dysregulation, I mean an inversion of that pattern. So tired but wired, which means we're waking up with low cortisol, but it's high by the evening because of all the stress stimulus we've got throughout the day and our inability to switch off. We can see this very clearly in our HRV. So if anyone has like a Whoop or an Aura that tracks your heart rate variability, we're looking for as big a heart rate variability as possible because that's us switching between our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic nervous system. So how much we respond when we're stressed, that's our sympathetic nervous system. That's us like, we're going to run away from the tiger or we're going to do the presentation. And then we drop into the parasympathetic nervous system when we can calm down. So the bigger the gap between that, the better. But if we're super stressed and we're reaching burnout, our HRV will be very, very low. The one thing I will say, and I know I talked about this a bit last week, alcohol will also absolutely neuter your HRV. So if you're having a glass of wine, it's probably more that's determining your HRV readings overnight versus this, but it could be a combination of the two. So it's important to kind of cut that alcohol out for a while, see if you have a really positive change in your HRV. If you don't, then you should be going to have your cortisol tested. Again, this is a very vicious cycle. You continue to have the decline, and that's why we end up in burnout. And then finally on vitamin D. So when we have that deficiency, then our immune system is compromised. Obviously, the more we're off sick, the harder work gets, and it gets harder and harder to reboot on our energy levels as well. So our stress levels increase, more cortisol. And as I said, if you do live in a country where you don't get a lot of sunlight, whether that's in the winter or for any other reason, actually very common in the Middle East, both because of wardrobe and staying indoors all the time. There's no natural sunlight hitting our skin. So supplementation in this space is something that can really, really help. And then we do have the joys of perimenopause and andropause. So our sex hormones, we've talked a little bit previously about estrogen and progesterone and the fluctuations of those when we're in perimenopause. And that's typically between 40 and 55. And it can last that full 15 years, which is a joy. That does mean we have temperature changes in the body. It can mean we have the racing heart. It can mean we have the sleep disruption and the brain fog, and of course the energy crashes as well. So again, all very treatable. There used to be a lot of very bad press around things like HRT, but actually the studies that bad press were based on were very, very limited and have been since disproved. So it's definitely worth speaking to your doctor about hormone treatments. If you don't like doing that, and even if you do have that, there are still lots of lifestyle interventions as well that can happen. So things like changing your sleep patterns, avoiding alcohol, avoiding caffeine, that kind of thing that you can use to regulate those hormones more easily and allow your body to deal with those changes more easily. And exercise is your number one, particularly strength training, your number one kind of tooling against this to boost your metabolic energy, compensate for the fact you've got less estrogen going on in your body. For men with testosterone, as I said, there is a natural decline, but that should really only be around 1% every year after you're 40. But if you're under chronic stress, that can be faster because of the signaling that's going from your pituitary into your adrenal glands. If it doesn't produce enough DHEA, then it will mean that you are not producing as much testosterone. So there is a very clear link between stress and your sex hormones if you're male. And that means you have reduced sex drive, but it also impairs your cognitive function, your strength, your confidence levels. And then that can obviously take a real toll on your sort of overall sense of self-confidence. And it also impacts your physical performance. So you aren't able to perform as well in the gym and your body composition changes. You'll typically put a lot more weight on. Again, not remotely inevitable, absolutely addressable, but it does require having conversations with medical professionals to have these interventions. So your GP will not test for this as part of your annual medical unless you ask for it specifically, which is why it's important to use the right language and have the conversation. And I realize sometimes that can be quite awkward, but we really are looking to optimize, and the sake of one awkward conversation for your ongoing health is a pretty good trade-off, if you ask me. So how to actually get tested? As I said, I'll send out some specific language you can use, but go prepared. Just going and saying you're tired, they're trained very much to look for disease, not for optimal performance. So go to that. Obviously, you also have options if you wanted to go to a private GP or a health coach that can help you with this. I work very closely with labs in different countries where you could just order the tests online. They get delivered to your house. You do the tests, you send them back, and then they have a consultation with you as well. But you want to look at a complete executive panel to test these things together because they're very closely interlinked, as we've covered. So thyroid, you don't want just TSH, which is what they will typically test for. You want TSH, free T3, free T4, and TPO antibodies. And the reason I say TPO antibodies is if you have a high ratio of those, that means you do have an autoimmune. Your body is turning on itself and attacking your own cells and attacking your thyroid tissues. It's actually remarkably common. So it can be anywhere up to 7 to 10% of a population in a developed country. And if you're in a developed country where you do have pollutants and a lot of sitting indoors and air conditioning units going around and around, then actually it's significantly higher. So somewhere like Hong Kong, you'd expect it to be somewhere between 15 to 20% of people will have Hashimoto's, and it will be undiagnosed. So you don't know how to deal with that. That can be dealt with medical interventions, but also things like avoiding gluten, avoiding caffeine, avoiding dairy, cutting these things out, and then gradually reintroducing them and seeing what's back. If you can get tested for your fasting glucose, your insulin levels, and have a full lipid panel. From an inflammation perspective, inflammation can come from a lot of factors of things that we consume, but also from stress. So if we're not getting enough sleep, if we have very high cortisol levels, we can have inflammation markers that can really catch us off guard. And you will be fine, as I said, for up to 5 years, maybe even 7. But eventually, these are causing plaques that are depositing themselves across your system. And that leads to, in later life, a significant risk of heart attack and stroke. So looking at inflammation now, which is typically a stress response, managing that now at our age means we're saving ourselves a lot of pain and heartache, literal heartache, further down the line. When we're looking at nutrients, as I said, ideally we're not just testing for ferritin, we're also testing for vitamin D, B12, folate, and magnesium. And there are multiple other iron tests as well that can be done if you want to look at more than ferritin. And then hormones if relevant. So if you are noticing indications that we've talked about, reduced sex drive is obviously the very first one. Get a comprehensive hormone panel. Ask for that to be tested. For females, that's typically something called the Dutch test, and you can get that with the cortisol testing throughout the day. And for men, it's testosterone testing specifically. And finally, I've obviously already talked about this one, but the cortisol testing with the 4-point test throughout the course of the day. All right, I'm nearly at the end of mine. But in terms of what to do then with your results, I would strongly advise not going off to a lab, getting a result and just having that PDF sent to you because A, a lot of it looks like gobbledygook. B, if any of it comes back red, it's going to look very scary. So I would always advise working with a professional who knows how to interpret this for you. As I said, I'm very happy to make some recommendations of labs that we use through my coaching business, but they will then be able to sit you down, take you through it and talk about the different lifestyle interventions. And then if you want to then go and have a conversation with your GP, what you should be asking specifically. With root cause analysis, it's really about, yes, you might have an abnormal result, but that's a symptom. So what is the underlying cause of that? And that can be something that you've become very, very used to over the course of the last decade. So it's really important to get kind of down to the root cause. It could be diet, it could be stress, it could be certain habits, you could be overtraining. That's actually a very common cause of things like low iron. So treating the number and actually just getting someone to prescribe something is fine, but it's only going to treat the symptom. You really need to be looking for the root cause about it. And then having those targeted interventions, experimenting with different things to see how you're managing it. A lot of that will be nutrition, supplementation, which we've talked about, and lifestyle modifications. So I'm under no illusion. It's not like we can all just walk away from our work and just go, I don't want to be stressed anymore. And stress itself is not a negative thing. It's that if we're chronically stressed and our bodies aren't able to effectively go back around that hormonal loop reset and actually stop producing some of those hormones. And then finally, as always, if you can't measure it, then you don't know if you're making progress. And it's really easy for us to convince ourselves one way or the other. So getting retested on a regular basis is a really good way to sort of track whether those interventions are really working. So I'm always a big fan of actually using the data.